Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Evil Monkey here, back with our build guide. And this one's for Killer Recipe Blair, which is an incredibly fun module that basically turns Blair into this mobile aerial artillery unit that just rains fire down upon all of his enemies. And this is because he has insane amounts of rapid high damage that also is on low cooldowns. And the other thing is he can pretty much indefinitely stay in the air, similar to Serena, because some of his abilities give him levitate, allowing him to just free target enemies from way up in the air, which also gives him insane survivability because enemies don't know what to do when you're that far up in the air. But if you guys don't know what Killer Recipe does, let me go and throw it up on the screen there. Go ahead and pause and read if you need to. But the nice thing about Killer Recipe is it kind of turns Blair into more of a jack of all trades DPS. He can kind of just do all content with this module. It's just overall just a really fun one. But that's enough of me yapping. Let's go and get you guys into this build guide so you can get out there with Blair. And like always, we gotta start with our mod section, where we'll go ahead and go over every module in the build and break them down. And this time, let's go ahead and start off our mods with our cooldown mods, where the first one being Nimble Fingers. Now, this one is just your basic cooldown module, so it has no downside and gives us a decent amount of skill cooldown for free. Then we have Shield Consumption. This one's going to give us the largest amount of skill cooldown possible in the game from any module that's a non-Ancestor module, with the only downside being minus max shield, which we really don't care about for Blair, because for Blair we're going to end up focusing on max HP, since your second ability heals you based off your max HP. This becomes kind of another free one to run because we don't care about that shield value. Why do we actually want so much cooldown? Well, there's two big reasons. One is it does help us stack up our trigger module, Domino Drive, a lot easier. But the second reason is because this allows us to cast your first ability back to back to back, which is pretty nice because this is a large damage ability, number one, and number two, while you're casting your first ability, you pretty much hover in the air, which is nice for survivability because most enemy AI doesn't know what to do with an enemy in the air. There's plenty of melee enemies that can't hit you up there, and there's plenty of enemies that shoot that just end up not really looking up. So not only does this give us an easier way to target our first ability, since we're able to shoot from basically high ground in this sense, but also a lot of survivability because a lot of enemies just, once again, don't know what to do with you in the air. So you just end up taking a lot less damage on average than someone who's on the ground. And on top of wanting to be able to spam out our first ability a whole bunch, we're also going to want to ramp up its damage a whole lot. And one of the ways we're going to do that is through crit, with our first crit module here being Skill Concentration, which is our basic skill critical hit damage module, so it has no downside, and honestly gives us a fairly sizable chunk of skill crit damage. We'll just go ahead and take this one to ramp up our damage a lot. And then we'll take Front Lines and Emergency Measures for the same reason of this gives us a mixture of skill critical hit rate, which we need to be able to hit 100% skill critical hit rate, and then also it gives us a nice sizable chunk of skill crit damage, which once again we want to use to ramp up our damage. So why is Blair actually a crit character in this build, and why do we only need to run 3 crit modules here? Well, that's thanks to, one, Blair actually has a fairly high base skill critical hit rate at 28%, and then two, thanks to his passive, and his passive is whenever an enemy is affected by burn, he gains increased skill crit damage against them, and increased skill critical hit rate, and both these affect the base values. In fact, if he's hitting an enemy that's affected by burn, he gets a base of 50% skill critical hit rate, and an additional, I believe, 30% skill crit damage, which this just allows him to hit a fairly consistent skill critical hit rate without actually needing to super heavily invest into that stat. And it also allows him to really ramp up the damage, thanks to him having a higher base skill critical hit damage than most Descendants. And that's why crit's just such a good stat on Blair, is really just because of those two reasons. And of course, we also gotta increase our skill damage through skill power. And for that one, we're gonna grab Power Increase, which gives us increase base skill power boost ratio. And the reason we want this one is because in the damage formula for First Descendant, one of the big things you really want to balance out your skill power pools. This kind of maximizes your damage. And we're already getting a lot of fire skill power boost ratio from Domino Drive and our Reactor. So it turns out running power increase here gives the largest damage increase. And then the final module that we'll use to really ramp up our damage here will be Chain Reaction. Now this one's a really cool one that's tied to our trigger module, Domino Drive. So while Domino Drive is active, Chain Reaction will give you a 20% additional damage to all skill damage. And once again, Blair's first ability is a fairly high damage ability, so 20% really ramps it up even further. And on top of that, your fourth ability is also an incredibly high damage ability, so getting 20% across the board on all of our skill damage is a significant damage leap. And then the next module we want to run here is Skill Extension, and this is because of our first ability, which kind of has a unique interaction with skill duration. See, normally an ability just gets affected no matter what by skill duration, but for your first ability, its cast time only gets extended every 17% of skill duration. And we want to extend out the cast of our first ability so that we can spam it back to back, as we talked about in our cooldown section. And it turns out skill extension gives us just enough skill duration that we can do those back-to-back casts without having to wait for our first ability to come off cooldown. And then we also want to run a survivability module, and in this case we're going to be running HP amplification, since this gives us max HP with the only downside being minus max shields. And as we talked about in the cooldown section, we only really care about the max HP, since Blair heals with his second ability based off his max HP. And then as always, we're going to go ahead and move our Ancestor mod to its own section, where we'll go over every stat you can roll on it, break them down, and put them into a tier chart that you guys can use as a reference if your Ancestor module is good, or if you want to go ahead and re-roll it. Now if you want to jump to that right now, there's a link in the description, and a timestamp in the timeline of the video itself. And now that we finished all of our main modules, let's go ahead and jump into our trigger module, and for this one we will be running Domino Drive. And this is pretty much for two big reasons. The first one is that it gives stacking fire skill power boost ratio, which, thanks to us having incredibly low cooldowns, and this build already being fairly spammy, we can stack this really quickly. And we really want this fire skill power boost ratio because not only does it ramp up Blair's damage a lot, thanks to him being a fire descendant, it also interacts with one of our mutant cells, which we'll go over later in the build, to help further reduce fire resistance of the enemies, which, as you get into endgame, it becomes a big deal to be able to reduce the enemy's resistance values because they get fairly high and make the enemies pretty tanky. The second reason that we want to run this is because of chain reaction, since as we talked about, Blair has fairly high scalings. With Killer Recipe, adding 20% additional damage on abilities that are already doing insane damage will really ramp up our damage to even higher heights. Now, just as a quick note though, with Domino Drive, we do not care about the skill effect range at all. That's going to end up being a dead stat, because Blair can't increase his range beyond their base values. So we really only care about the fire skill power boost ratio and chain reaction. And finally, time for our Ancestor module section, which we'll go ahead and go over every stat you can roll in your Ancestor module, break them down and put them into a tier chart that you guys can use as a reference if your Ancestor module is good, or if you want to go ahead and re-roll it. Starting with S tier, which has our best stats, we have Dimension Skill Power Boost Ratio. Now the reason why this is one of your best stats is because Blair is a Dimension character with each of his damage abilities scaling off Dimension, and you can't really get Dimension Skill Power really outside of your Ancestor module. So this is just one of the best places to increase it, and a good way to increase our overall damage. They have a skill critical hit damage. Now the reason why this one's here is because Blair is a skill crit character, of course, and his passive also gives him increased skill critical hit damage against targets that are burning. So this is just a really great way to ramp up his damage even further. And then moving on to A tier, which these are still incredibly good stats, we have Fire Skill Power Boost Ratio. Now this is kind of similar logic to Dimension Skill Power. Blair's a Fire Descendant, so this will just ramp up his damage a lot. And the only reason this is an A tier instead of S tier is because we already get stacking Fire Power Boost Ratio from Domino Drive, so we just don't need this as much as we would something like Dimension. And then we have Max HP. Now this is once again because Blair scales really well with HP, since your second ability heals you based off your max HP, and your custom resources. Then we have Skill Duration Up. Now this is just a really nice one because it can extend the duration of your first ability, and also you can get a high enough value in this you can remove the skill duration mod out of your mod section and replace it with something like more damage. And time for B tier. These are your middle of the pack values. We have Dimension Skill Modifier. Once again, Blair is a Dimension character. But since all of his abilities have incredibly high scalings, adding the extra scaling from your Ancestor module really won't do much for a skill modifier, but it is slightly more damage, so it's not a bad stat to have. Then we have Skill Cooldown. Really the only use in rolling this is that you could replace cooldown in other places in your kit, such as your Reactor. You could replace the cooldown in your Reactor with more skill power, thus increasing your damage. And then we have Max MP. Now this is similar to your Max HP. Blair scales really well with this because his second ability also heals his MP based off his Max MP. But because you really don't have any cost issues with Blair, this is just kind of a middle of the pack value. And we have Defense. Defense is just always a really good survivability stat to roll. It's never bad, but it's usually not like the best stats we can roll, so it ends up here in B tier. And then we have C tier. Now C tier is kind of an interesting one. These are values you just want to completely avoid because they rarely ever help the build very much, but if you take them as a negative, they will hurt the build a lot. And the first one here is Skill Effect Range. Now this one seems probably a little odd, but it does turn out Blair actually does have on each of his abilities a range scaling. But the issue is that range scaling is set at 100%. And that 100% is your base range, meaning you actually can't increase any of these abilities, the explosion range that they have, beyond their base. But if you were to roll them as a negative on your Ancestor module, you would actually decrease the AoE of your explosions, meaning you'd suffer in wave clear and being able to hit targets easier. So you just want to avoid skill effect range so you don't accidentally decrease the base range. And we have skill critical hit rate. Now, Blair already has incredibly high skill critical hit rate thanks to his passive giving him increased skill crit against enemies that are under the effect of burn. So you really don't need much, honestly, to get Blair to 100% skill critical hit rate. In fact, the majority of it will be from our two mods, Frontlines and Emergency Measures. But because those also already give us skill critical hit damage as well, there's really no point on removing them. So you really don't want to roll this as a positive because it would mainly just be overkill. You could roll much better values. And you don't want to roll this as a negative because then you just lower your skill critical hit rate and you're no longer having that consistent high damage that you want. And then lastly, we have D tier. Now these are values that really don't help the build at all. Roll them as positive, but luckily they also don't really hurt the build at all if you roll them as a negative, making them perfect stats to take as your negative value on your Ancestor module, so you can roll higher stats on your positives. With our first value here being skill cost. As we talked about, Blair doesn't really have any cost issues because he can regenerate his MP through his second ability, so we really don't care about increasing the cost at all. Then we have singular skill power boost ratio and singular skill modifier. Once again, Blair's a Dimension character. He has 0 singular modifiers or any scalings here, so we really don't care about this value. And then max shield. Once again, we want to focus on max HP, and in fact, we're pretty much already bringing our max shield to nothing thanks to our mods, so we can just not care about this value at all. And that's going to wrap it up for the tier chart. Hopefully this helped you guys while you're choosing your Ancestor modules. I know that we've wrapped up all of our module sections, let's go ahead and jump into our Arche Tree now. So for this one, we're going to be running a 2 Mutant Cell setup, but we'll go into the Mutant Cells here in a minute. Let's first go over all the nodes we have to hit along the way to those. So the first thing I want to point out is we're grabbing 2 HP nodes at the bottom. This is just for extra survivability, since Blair scales really well with HP. And then we're also going to grab the crit hit rate and crit damage nodes. This is so Blair can do more damage, because once again, he's a crit character. And those nodes are going to help us get to that 100% skill critical hit rate against targets that are burning. And then we also want to grab the gold cooldown node. Now, this is just so that once again we can spam our first ability back to back to back and stay indefinitely in the air. And this just helps us get to that max cooldown rate to be able to do that. And then now going into the actual mutant cells themselves, in the top right and top left, in the top left we have defense neutralization. So The reason we're running this one is because this helps shred resistance, and it turns out the further you go into First Descendant, especially once you hit endgame, often enough it becomes less of increasing your damage and more of lowering enemy resistance values, because enemies get fairly tanky, and this actually ramps up our damage the most. And because you'll be hitting enemies from the air and from a long distance a lot of the time, something like defense neutralization is really easy to set up, because you'll often hit enemies way before any of your allies do. Since defense neutralization, you have to hit them while they're at max HP. And then our other mutant cell, over there in the upper right, we have Fire Chain Catalyst. Now this one also reduces enemy resistance values. Once again, that's just how we gotta maximize our damage in endgame. And this one is based off our fire skill power, which, thanks to Domino Drive, and more than likely rolling some in your Ancestor module, you're able to shred a lot of resistance with this. In fact, we'll be shredding resistance in one more way in our component set. Now let's move on to the components that we'll be running for this build, which will be Firebrand set. Now, we're running this one because of its 4-set bonus, which, anytime you inflict burn on an enemy, you reduce their fire resistance, which it turns out all of Blair's damage abilities can inflict burn. Meaning we're just constantly able to reduce their fire resistance, which is really good in endgame, because once again, a large portion of that becomes less of increasing your damage, and honestly more of reducing the enemy's resistance values because of how tanky they get. Now, for the substats we're going to want here, we're going to want max HP, max MP, defense, and MP recovery modifier. Blair is fairly self-sufficient, even in the air, thanks to his second ability, but because that heals based off max HP and max MP, we want to really increase those values. And now, going over our component cores we're going to want 4 max HP, because once again, HP scales really well with Blair, and then 4 defense. This is just a really good survivability stat to have, as it reduces the amount of damage you take from most sources. And now let's finally move on to our Inversion Reinforcement. And for this time, we're going to mainly focus on survivability, because Blair already has enough DPS/offensive stats. And for our first node, we're going to take Selective Stimulation. Now, even though, yes, Blair does heal through his second ability, having another source of healing doesn't hurt. And then we're going to take Deploy Hardened Shell, which gives us incoming damage taken reduction, which is really good because things in endgame hit really hard, so reducing the damage you take by a percentage is really good. And then Combat Adaptation is the same logic. Every time you defeat an enemy, you get incoming damage taken reduction at a percentage value, so just stacking these two means you'll take significantly less damage from those endgame enemies. And going on to the reactor we're going to want to run for this build, we're going to be running a Fire Dimension Reactor. This is because Blair is a Fire Descendant, and all of his damage abilities scale off Dimension. And then for our substats, we're going to want Skill Cooldown. This is once again to be able to hit that max cooldown rate, so we can spam our first ability back to back. And then Skill Critical Hit Damage. This is once again because Blair is a crit character, and that passive gives him increased base skill crit damage, so this scales really nicely for him. And now time for the weapon we'll be running in this build, and for this one we'll be running Truly Deadly Arson, and this is almost entirely because of its unique ability, in which every time you use a fire type skill, you gain a stack, and when you damage an enemy with a continuous type damage ability, those stacks get transformed into continuous type skill power. And as it turns out, Blair's a Fire Descendant, and all of his damage abilities have the modifier Continuous Damage type. Meaning this is just a really great way, and a free way, for us to be able to ramp up our damage to be even higher on Killer Recipe Blair. Now, because we only care about that unique ability, the rest of the build is pretty bare bones. We only actually need 2 modules here, the Incinerator to help spread burn, and Brisk Walk to just give us a little bit more movement speed. And for our cores, all we're going to use is grapple hook cores, because this will help us with our mobility in the air, since Descendants who hover in the air tend to have slower movement speed, so we need the grapple hooks to help get around the battlefield a lot faster. And now let's finally hop into the tips and tricks section, which I'll show you guys a few things to help you along while you're playing Blair. So the first thing I want to show you guys was about the kick. So you can actually aim it whatever direction you want to. There's no actual, like, even if you're in the air, anywhere you're just aiming goes in that direction. It's kind of cool because it's going to allow you to dodge a few things or just get even higher on the map if you need to. The other thing I wanted to show you guys with the kick here was that it also resets your jump count. So you can get like a couple jumps there to get higher if you need to. Also, while you're in the air, your first ability lets you kind of slow fall as well. If you cast it right, you basically lose like no momentum and then just get back in there with the kick. Keep going. Now the big thing is you want to use your first ability in the air because its scaling actually gets massively increased here, as you guys can see here, while you're in midair. In fact, it's almost doubled. So you want to try and use your first ability in the air, even if it's just like a little jump. It should work. Next thing I wanted to talk to you guys about was your fourth ability. So your fourth ability locks onto enemies, as I'm sure you guys know. You can target multiple enemies, like so. But the other cool thing is if there's only a singular enemy there, you can actually have them all lock onto that one enemy, and they'll all do damage to them. It's just a great way for bosses or tyrants. You can just kind of pop those guys because this does a lot of damage. So each individual one will actually hit him at full damage. And then the final thing I wanted to kind of give you guys a tip about was your second ability. So your second ability heals you based off your custom resource stacks. And when we do our fourth ability here, it consumes them all. So if you need to heal and you want to use your fourth ability, don't forget to use your second ability first so you get the heal and then your fourth. Because your second ability doesn't consume the stacks. It just bases your heal off how many custom resource stacks you have. I believe it's like 8% of your max HP per custom resource bar. That's just something I wanted to give you guys a little tip about because it's something I forget to do a lot. So sometimes I'll be really low HP, use my fourth ability, and then I get downed because I forgot to use my second ability to heal myself before my fourth. So just try and always keep that in mind. Anyways, that's all I wanted to show you guys for tips and tricks here. Luckily, Killer Recipe Blair is fairly straightforward. And that's going to go and wrap up for this Blair build guide. Now, Killer Recipe is pretty good in most of the in-game modes, making a good general in-game build. But let me know what you guys think about the build down in the comments down below. Or if you have any questions, also go ahead and hit me down below as well. And if you guys did enjoy the video or plan to use the build, I'd appreciate you hitting that like button. It does help out the video a lot. If you want to know when new videos are coming out, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. And I also do stream most days on Twitch. Let me go and throw up information on the screen there. And once again, if you guys could hit that like button, it really does help out the video, get out to a lot more people. But that's going to go and wrap up for this build guide. Appreciate y'all watching. I'll catch y'all again next time.